A billionaire who swore he'd never have kids is stopped cold when a dirt-covered little girl walks into his office, looks him dead in the eyes and says, "I don't want your money, I want my dad." New York City in winter was a city of glass and steel, cold and glittering. The streets buzzed with honking horns, flashing billboards, and people wrapped in thick coats hurrying from one place to another. Above it all, towering over the chaos like a king in his castle, was the Hayes Corporation building. 50 stories of power and ambition. Inside the executive office on the top floor, Michael Hayes stood with his back to the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out over the city that had made him rich. He was a man who turned concrete into empires, and profit into legacy. His dark hair was styled with precision, his tailored navy suit impeccable, and the blue of his eyes as sharp as the skyline itself. But there was no warmth in those eyes, only calculation, control, and the constant hum of dissatisfaction he kept buried beneath layers of wealth and success. The office behind him was minimalist and cold, steel surfaces, black leather, no family photos, no personal touches. Only a desk covered in perfectly aligned folders and a bottle of top-shelf whiskey he barely touched. Everything had a purpose, and nothing in his world existed without reason, least of all emotion. He turned when his assistant Julia entered, tablet in hand. She moved quickly, efficiently, like someone who knew not to waste a single second of his time. "Your 6 p.m. meeting with the European investors is confirmed," she said, eyes flicking to the screen. "They want to discuss the expansion timeline again." Michael nodded, uninterested. "Let legal deal with the timeline. I'm not wasting hours on their panic." "Understood," Julia replied, then hesitated. "Anything else before I go?" He looked at her for a moment and then asked, "Do you have kids?" She blinked, surprised. "I do. A daughter. Why?" Michael walked toward his desk, picking up a pen but not writing anything. "I don't understand it. The obsession with family, with children. They take your time, drain your money, mess up your life, and in the end, for what?" Julia shifted uncomfortably. "It's different when they're yours." He raised an eyebrow. "I've never seen the appeal. Kids are like tiny chaotic anchors, dragging people down." She didn't respond. She knew better than to argue. After a long pause, she nodded once and exited the room. Michael leaned back in his chair, eyes flicking to the wall of windows again. He had everything he'd ever wanted. Power, wealth, control. And still, a hollow feeling crept in when the lights of the city flickered against the night sky. He told himself it was nothing. Just the cold. Just the quiet. Somewhere outside, down on the crowded streets, a child was walking alone through the snow, but Michael Hayes didn't know that yet, and he certainly didn't know she was heading straight for him. The lobby of the Hayes Corporation building was quiet, dimly lit, and nearly empty. It was already past 8 in the evening, and the last of the employees had filtered out long ago, leaving only the echo of their hurried steps behind. The marble floors gleamed under the soft light, reflecting the golden trim of the towering columns and the elegant curves of the chandelier that hung far above. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, coating the streets in white, and muffling the sounds of the city. Security guards chatted softly near the front entrance, sipping coffee and glancing occasionally at the monitors. Nothing ever really happened this late. The building was locked down and no one without clearance could enter past 7 p.m. Which is why no one noticed the small figure slip through the revolving door. She was tiny, maybe 6 years old, though small even for that age, and the door had been difficult for her to push. Her light blue dress, once delicate and sweet, now hung from her in wrinkles and stains. The lace at the hem was frayed, and a tear exposed her knee. Her boots were too big and cracked at the sides, her ankles wobbling slightly as she stepped carefully onto the marble. Her cheeks were flushed red from the cold, and her blonde curls were tangled and half covered by a hood that had slipped down long ago. In one hand, she held a white teddy bear. It was old, one ear torn, the fur matted and graying at the edges from dirt and wear. But she clung to it with both protectiveness and desperation, as if the bear were the only thing in the world she trusted. Her other hand trembled slightly at her side. Her eyes, blue as frost, scanned the cavernous lobby with uncertainty, but also with purpose. She didn't belong here, and even at a glance anyone could tell she hadn't come from any place warm or safe. Her eyes were wide, not from wonder but from fear. The kind that doesn't fade when you're indoors, or when someone smiles. The fear of a child who had gone too long without protection. She wandered past the reception desk, which was unmanned at this hour. No one stopped her. The guards were in the back room and the cameras were angled toward the doors, not the center of the lobby. Her small footsteps echoed with each movement. She wasn't running or crying, she was just walking, like she had been walking all day, as if one more step might finally take her where she was supposed to be. The elevator pinged. Michael Hayes stepped out, checking his phone. He had stayed late reviewing the downtown project files and was ready to head home. He didn't look up at first, he never expected anything in the building to surprise him, but then he heard the soft, rhythmic tapping of small feet, and when he raised his eyes, he saw her. The sight stopped him cold. At first he thought she might be a hallucination, a leftover image from some forgotten memory, or even a ghost, but no, she was real, standing in the middle of his lobby, staring directly at him. A little girl, disheveled, dirty, dressed in clothes more fitting for a summer park than a snowy New York night. She looked like she had walked out of a storybook and fallen straight into his empire of glass and steel. He didn't move, unsure of what to say. She blinked, clutched her bear tighter, and took a cautious step forward. He frowned, instinctively reaching for his wallet, thinking she must be a lost child, or worse, a beggar sent here by some manipulative adult. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice low, uncertain. "Where are your parents?" She didn't answer. Her lips parted slightly but no words came. She took another step forward. Her hands were shaking. He pulled out a crisp $50 bill, held it toward her awkwardly. "Here, buy yourself something warm, something to eat." She stared at the money, but made no move to take it. Her eyes were locked on his, as if studying something far beyond his appearance. Then in a quiet, broken voice she finally spoke. "I don't need money," she said, barely louder than a whisper. "I need you, Daddy." The word hit him harder than any courtroom argument or business betrayal ever had. His hand froze mid-air. His jaw tightened, and his heart, so often shielded by layers of logic and pride, skipped a beat. She wasn't begging, she wasn't lying, at least not in the way people lie to get something. She looked at him the way only someone who believed every word could look. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were sure. Michael couldn't move. His body remained rigid, and his thoughts spiraled into chaos. He didn't know this girl, that was impossible, and yet, there she was, looking at him like she had known him forever, looking at him like she had finally found him. And for the first time in years, Michael Hayes had no idea what to do next. Michael stood frozen in the lobby, unable to tear his eyes away from the little girl. The words she had spoken echoed in his mind louder than any noise outside the towering glass walls. "I need you, Daddy." It didn't make sense, it couldn't be real, and yet, looking at her, those eyes, that fragile voice, the way she clutched the teddy bear to her chest, he felt something crack deep inside, something old and tightly sealed. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Where did you come from?" he asked more firmly this time, but she didn't answer. She simply stood there, her gaze unwavering. Michael signaled to the front desk, finally drawing the attention of the security team. They rushed out, startled at the sight of the child and more startled by the look on their boss's face. Disbelief, confusion, and something like fear. They tried to question her, but she barely spoke. All she said was that her name was Emma and that she had been looking for her father. That was it. No last name, no address, nothing about a guardian. When the police arrived, she remained quiet, even as they gently asked about her family, her home, where she had come from. She only said she had walked for a long time, and that she was sure this man, Michael Hayes, was her father. Michael wanted to believe it was a mistake, a sad coincidence, some delusion maybe, but something inside him wouldn't let it go. The girl's eyes were a mirror of his own, and the shape of her face tugged at a place in his memory he couldn't quite reach. He found himself staring at her when he thought no one was looking. Something about her didn't feel random. He paid for a hotel room nearby and hired a nurse to watch over her. She refused to be separated from the teddy bear curling around it each night as if it were her shield. Michael didn't sleep much that weekend. He spent hours researching missing children databases, scrolling through pages of names and faces. No Emma matched. No reports of a runaway or an abduction in the city matched her description. It was as if she had stepped out of thin air. By Monday morning he had done something he never imagined he'd do. He ordered a DNA test. His assistant, Julia, stared at him as he stood in her office doorway, asking her to arrange everything with quiet urgency. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" she asked, confused and a little cautious. "It could open a lot of doors. You can't close again." "I just want to know," he said flatly. "I need the truth. Either way." The results came back on Thursday. A sleek white envelope lay on his desk, as plain and unassuming as any other report. He stared at it for a long time, tapping his pen against the edge, heart racing beneath his otherwise calm exterior. When he finally opened it, the words were printed in clean, clinical lines, but the meaning slammed into him like a freight train. Paternal probability, 99.9%. Conclusion: Michael Hayes is the biological father of Emma Bennett. He dropped the paper onto the desk, staring at it like it might suddenly change. The room was silent. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed to pause. His first thought was that the lab had made a mistake. His second thought was that someone had tricked him. But no, he'd used a private, verified facility. There had been no leaks, no tampering. It was real. The science didn't lie. Michael leaned back in his chair, hands pressed to his temples. His breath came shallowly, chest tight with something that wasn't quite panic, but wasn't calm either. He remembered Sarah Bennett, a quiet, kind nurse he had dated briefly nearly 7 years ago. She had been sweet, grounded and warm in a way that had made him uncomfortable. She talked about wanting a child, a family, a future. He had ended it quickly after that, vanishing from her life without explanation. He hadn't looked back. But now, as he sat in the center of his empire, surrounded by chrome and silence, the past was suddenly reaching through the years and slamming into the present. Emma. His daughter. The word didn't even feel real in his mouth. He said it aloud just to hear it, and even then it felt like trying on someone else's shoes. His daughter. He had a daughter. He thought about the way she had looked at him in the lobby, the certainty in her voice, the quiet strength in her small frame. He had built skyscrapers, but he'd never built anything that looked at him with that kind of hope. He picked up the envelope again and stared at the words. She was his. Flesh and blood. Somehow, someway, Sarah had carried and raised this child without ever telling him, and now she was here, abandoned, afraid, and looking for the one person she believed would save her. And he didn't even know what her favorite color was. The following morning, Michael sat in his office long before anyone else arrived. The city outside was still waking up, veiled in a pale fog that rolled over rooftops and blurred the skyline. He barely noticed. The DNA results sat open on his desk, though he no longer needed to look at them. The numbers, the words, the impossible truth, they were etched into his mind now, impossible to unsee or forget. He had a daughter. The reality of it crept into his thoughts slowly but persistently, like water slipping through the cracks of a stone wall. For the first time in years he couldn't focus on work. He didn't respond to emails. He didn't return calls. Instead he stared blankly at the framed architectural renderings on his wall, remembering a woman he had deliberately forgotten. Sarah Bennett. He hadn't thought about her in years. She had been unlike the other women who passed through his life. There had been a warmth in her, something sincere that had unsettled him more than he ever admitted. She'd been working long shifts at the hospital, always tired but always smiling. He remembered how she talked about children. Not with longing exactly, but with conviction. Like she knew she was meant to be a mother. He, on the other hand, had recoiled at the very idea. Family had always been a word soaked in pain for him, his own childhood tainted by neglect, by a mother who had died too soon and a father who had drowned himself in cheap liquor and bad decisions. Michael had clawed his way out of that darkness by cutting every tie, erasing emotion, and building a fortress out of concrete, money and silence. So when Sarah told him she wanted to keep the baby, he had disappeared. There hadn't been an argument, no dramatic confrontation, just distance. He stopped returning calls, he buried her name under contracts and acquisitions, and then he moved on, or at least convinced himself he had. But now the past had returned, not in the form of guilt or memory, but in the form of a real, breathing child who had shown up in his lobby calling him Daddy. Michael knew he had to find answers. He had to know what happened to Sarah. Using every connection he had, he began searching. Within hours his legal team had tracked down medical records, city documents, and even a forwarding address listed under her name. It led him to a small, quiet hospice facility in Queens. The building was modest, tucked between an old church and a bakery that had seen better days. He drove there himself. No driver, no assistant, just him. The nurse at the front desk recognized the name immediately. Her face softened when he asked about Sarah. She led him down a narrow hallway filled with the scent of antiseptic and faint whispers from behind closed doors. Finally, she stopped in front of a room that now stood empty. "She passed away 3 months ago," the nurse said gently. "Ovarian cancer. It was aggressive. She fought hard. Mostly for her daughter. Emma was here every day." Michael stepped into the room. It was clean, the bed stripped, but her presence still lingered in the air. On the windowsill sat a dried-up bouquet of wildflowers in a cracked mason jar. Taped to the wall was a child's drawing, stick figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. The nurse handed him a small box. "She left this for Emma. We didn't know how to find anyone, and then, well, she showed up at your building. Didn't she?" Inside the box were a few photographs, a tiny silver bracelet, and a worn, leather-bound notebook. Back in his car, Michael sat with the notebook in his lap. He opened it, slowly flipping through pages filled with Sarah's neat looping handwriting. It was part diary, part letter to Emma. There were entries about Emma's first steps, her first word, it had been light, and how she used to sing to the moon at night. There were pages filled with fear and strength, written by a woman who knew she was running out of time. And finally, near the end, Michael found a message written just for him. "If you're reading this, it means she found you. I hope she did. I didn't tell you because I was afraid. Afraid you'd reject her the way you rejected the idea of us. But even after all this time, I never stopped believing you could be a good man, Michael. You just didn't know how to be one yet. Our daughter is brave. She's stronger than me, and more forgiving than you deserve. But I know her heart. She'll never stop believing in you. Don't waste that." Michael's hands trembled as he closed the notebook. His chest ached with something sharp and unfamiliar. It wasn't just grief or regret. It was shame, too. Deep and consuming. He had left Sarah to raise their child alone, and now Sarah was gone, but Emma was still here, still searching, still waiting. Act 2. The Living Unbuckled. For the first time in his life, Michael didn't feel like a powerful man. He felt like a coward who had run away from the one thing that truly mattered. He picked up his phone and dialed Julia. "Clear my schedule," he said, his voice hoarse. "All of it?" she asked, confused. "Yes, everything, and find a therapist who specializes in trauma. For children, she needs help." "Who?" Julia asked carefully. "My daughter," he said quietly. The words unfamiliar but final. "Her name is Emma." Michael brought Emma home that evening, not to a hotel or a temporary apartment, but to his own penthouse high above the city. An open space of glass and luxury that until now had been entirely designed for one man who needed no one. The moment they stepped through the doors, he realized how wrong that space now felt. The floors were polished and cold. The art on the walls was abstract, expressionless. There were no soft edges, no colors a child would like, no warmth. Everything had been chosen to match his taste, his solitude. And now, this fragile little girl stood there, clutching her teddy bear, too quiet, too still, as if afraid to touch anything or even breathe. He led her slowly through the living room, showing her the guest room he'd had prepared earlier in the day. A new bed had been delivered, and someone from his staff had rushed to fill it with soft blankets and a few toys. Still, the room felt too big for her, and she stood in the doorway like someone staring into a foreign world. She didn't ask questions. She didn't smile. She didn't let go of the bear. Michael crouched beside her and said gently, "This is your room now, you can sleep here, you're safe." Emma looked up at him but said nothing. Her eyes held something far older than 6 years, something wary and raw. That night, when he turned off the lights and closed the door halfway. She didn't cry. She simply curled into a ball, arms wrapped tightly around her bare, eyes open and alert long after the city lights outside had faded. Michael barely slept. He sat in his study with the notebook from Sarah open beside him, rereading her words. Every page felt like a door into a life he had missed. Her love for their daughter. The things he should have seen, should have known. He made a silent promise that night, without knowing exactly what it meant yet. But he meant it. He wouldn't abandon her again. The next morning he made pancakes himself. He had to Google the recipe and burned the first batch, but he kept going. Emma sat at the table, watching him without speaking, legs dangling off the chair too high for her feet to reach the ground. She didn't eat much, just picked at the food, her eyes flickering toward him and then away again. When he asked if she liked strawberries, she only nodded. He hired a therapist that week. A kind woman named Dr. Riley who specialized in childhood trauma. She met with Emma in the apartment, bringing colorful cards and puzzles, speaking in a voice so calm it barely made ripples in the air. Emma didn't talk much in the beginning, but she listened, and slowly something in her began to shift. Michael sat in on some sessions, at Dr. Riley's suggestion. He learned that Emma had been staying with a distant relative after Sarah got sick, a man who should never have been given that responsibility. There were signs of neglect, possibly worse. Dr. Riley didn't go into detail, but Michael saw it in the way Emma flinched when someone raised their voice, even on TV, in the way she couldn't sleep unless the lights were on, in the way she tested every act of kindness as if waiting for it to disappear. The days began to settle into something resembling a routine. Michael stopped going to the office every day. He worked from home when he could. He hired a private tutor for Emma, someone patient and soft-spoken, who taught her reading, math, and how to plant herbs in little ceramic pots on the balcony. She liked basil best, said it smelled like summer. He bought her a nightlight, shaped like the moon. Slowly, her drawings started changing, less gray and brown, more yellow and green. Still, there were hard days, days when she would wake up screaming from nightmares, days when she would push him away, refusing to talk or even look at him. He didn't know what to do at first. He wasn't used to anyone needing him, not like this. But he never yelled, never left. He learned to sit beside her without saying a word, just being there until she was ready to let him in again. One afternoon, as they were building a puzzle together on the living room floor, she reached out and took his hand without a word. It was small, warm and hesitant, but she didn't let go. Michael froze, staring down at their hands, feeling something settle into place inside him. He looked at her and said, "I'm not going anywhere, Emma." She didn't answer, but she gave a tiny nod, and that was enough. And each week brought small changes. She began humming when she played. She asked questions about the world, why the sky turned orange at sunset, why birds always seemed to fly in the same direction. She started calling him Dad one morning in the middle of breakfast. The word hung in the air like a sunrise, unexpected and quiet and beautiful. Michael had faced hostile takeovers, billion-dollar negotiations and global contracts, but nothing had ever mattered as much as getting that one word from her lips. He was still learning. Every day brought new fears about whether he was doing enough, doing it right, being the father she needed, but he was trying. And she was trying too. Two broken pieces learning how to belong together. And in all that trying, they were slowly becoming something neither of them had ever truly known before. A family. The weeks passed, and the bond between Michael and Emma deepened in quiet, steady ways. She began leaving drawings on his desk in the morning, colorful hearts, smiling stick figures, lopsided houses with curly smoke curling from the chimneys. He hung every one of them in his office, even though they clashed wildly with the cold minimalist decor. The staff said nothing, but Julia once paused in the doorway and smiled quietly, saying, "She's changing you." He didn't respond, but he didn't deny it either. Michael had started preparing to file for full legal custody. At first it had seemed like just another process, documents, lawyers, formalities, but he quickly realized that claiming guardianship of a real human being, especially a traumatized child, was unlike any contract he had ever signed. It required proof of stability, commitment and moral fitness, things no corporate title or bank account could substitute. Still, He had the best legal team in the city, and they were confident that the judge would favor him, given the biological connection and Emma's current well-being. But then, as often happens when the past is not truly dead, someone came forward. His lawyers received a notice from a man named Gregory Miller, a distant uncle of Sarah's, who had once served as Emma's temporary guardian during the final months of Sarah's illness. He was a man Michael had never heard of, and would have gladly gone his whole life without meeting. The legal petition filed by Gregory claimed that he was Emma's only remaining blood relative with a documented history of guardianship, and that her placement with a corporate executive like Michael was inappropriate, sudden, and emotionally destabilizing. The man's criminal record was light, mostly misdemeanors, a DUI and several citations for public disturbance, but nothing that outright disqualified him from making a claim. Worse still, he had managed to find a lawyer willing to argue the case in court, spinning a narrative that painted Michael as a selfish businessman who had ignored his child's existence until she was literally dropped in his lap. Michael was furious, not only because it was inaccurate but because it felt like Emma's stability, something that had taken weeks of fragile progress, was being threatened by a man who clearly didn't care about her beyond the potential check tied to custody. Gregory didn't want her. He wanted leverage. Emma, when gently told that someone else had come forward, retreated into herself. She didn't cry or speak. She simply stopped talking to anyone for 2 days. Even Dr. Riley couldn't reach her. When Michael finally coaxed her onto the couch beside him, she whispered, "He locked me in the laundry room once. I was cold." That was all she said. That was all he needed to hear. The custody hearing was scheduled within 3 weeks. It became public quickly. The media caught the scent of drama. Billionaire tycoon fights for daughter he didn't know existed, challenged by grieving uncle from working-class background. Tabloids splashed headlines about the secret child of Michael Hayes across front pages. Paparazzi waited outside the building, forcing Michael to hire extra security just to walk Emma to her therapy appointments. He kept her out of school and brought her teachers into the home. He tried to keep her routine intact, but the pressure was growing. Emma began sleeping in his bed again, waking up at night in quiet terror, whispering that she didn't want to go back. He held her close, brushing her hair back from her damp forehead, repeating, "You're not going anywhere. Not while I'm breathing." Despite the promises, despite the lawyers, despite the progress they had made, Michael began to worry. Family courts could be unpredictable, and Emma's trauma wasn't always easy to prove. Her silence, once protective, might be mistaken for detachment. Then, 2 days before the hearing, something worse happened. Emma disappeared. Michael had left her with Julia and a security guard while he attended a brief court meeting. They were at a secure floor of the Hayes building, with cameras on every corridor, but within 10 minutes she was gone. The guard had been distracted, Julia had stepped out to take a call, and in that sliver of time, someone had gotten to her. The police were called immediately. Michael activated every private investigator on his payroll. Surveillance footage was pulled. Eventually the truth unraveled. Gregory had been waiting. He hadn't come through the front. He had entered through the delivery garage with stolen credentials and taken her through a service stairwell. Michael felt something primal ignite inside him, a fury he hadn't felt since childhood. This wasn't a legal case anymore. It was a kidnapping. It was personal. The police warned him to stay out of it and let them handle it, but Michael knew people, and more importantly, he knew how to move faster than bureaucracy. He followed the trail through a network of surveillance feeds, ATM activity, and a tip from one of his old construction foremen, who had seen a van matching the description near a condemned warehouse on the outskirts of Brooklyn. It was almost midnight when Michael arrived at the site. No police, no news crews. Just him, his head of security, and the thin light of his car's headlights cutting through the dark. The warehouse was abandoned, hollowed out from years of weather and neglect. The windows were shattered, the door barely hung on its hinges. Inside, he found her. Emma was curled in a corner, dirty, shivering, her bear clutched tightly in her arms. Her lip was bleeding. Gregory was half drunk, shouting into a phone in the next room, demanding money from someone who never intended to send it. Michael didn't hesitate. He stepped in, grabbed Gregory by the collar and threw him to the ground with a force he didn't know he still possessed. The man tried to swing at him, but Michael blocked it easily. The security guard pulled Gregory away, calling the police. as backup finally began to arrive. Michael ran to Emma, dropping to his knees. She looked up at him with wide glassy eyes, then lunged forward, wrapping her arms around his neck and sobbing into his shoulder. "I knew you'd come," she whispered through her tears. "I knew it." Michael held her like he would never let go again, and this time he meant it, with every part of who he was. The hours that followed felt like a blur, both chaotic and unreal. Sirens pierced the night air as police swarmed the abandoned warehouse, lights flashing across broken windows and rotting beams. Officers handcuffed Gregory Miller and escorted him into the back of a cruiser, though Michael barely looked at him. His entire focus was on Emma, still trembling in his arms, her face pressed against his chest, her tiny hands gripping the fabric of his coat like it was the only solid thing left in the world. He held her tightly as paramedics checked her over, gently inspecting her bruises and scratches. She winced at the touch of cold hands, but she didn't cry again. She stayed quiet, her fingers never leaving Michael's sleeve. One of the EMTs asked if she wanted to ride in the ambulance, but she shook her head without a word. She only looked up at Michael and whispered, "With you." He carried her out himself, shielding her from the cameras and flashing lights as best he could. A blanket had been wrapped around her shoulders, and the teddy bear, filthy but still intact, was tucked under her arm. When they reached his car, she wouldn't let go of him, so he sat in the back seat with her, curled up in his lap, silent the entire drive home. The apartment was dark when they returned, the city lights glowing faintly beyond the windows. He brought her to the bathroom and ran warm water, helping her out of her dirty clothes and into a soft towel without asking questions. She looked smaller than ever under the bright lights, her arms thin, her shoulders hunched. He washed the blood from her lip with gentle hands, then carried her into his bedroom and tucked her under the covers. She stared at the ceiling for a long time before finally saying, "I was scared." Michael sat beside her and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I know," he said softly, "I was too, but you're safe now. He's never going to touch you again." Her eyes turned to him. "You came for me." He nodded, eyes burning. "I will always come for you. No matter what. That's what being your dad means." There was a pause. Then her voice, hoarse but steady. "Promise?" He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I promise." That night she fell asleep holding his hand and he didn't move until the morning light crept across the floor. The next few days were filled with legal procedures, follow-up medical evaluations, and countless statements to the police. Gregory Miller was formally charged with kidnapping, unlawful entry, and endangerment of a minor. The evidence was overwhelming and no judge would even entertain his custody claim now. But the court hearing still had to take place. Michael's legal team prepared with renewed focus, now armed not just with proof of parenthood, but evidence of direct harm from the man who had tried to take Emma from him. On the morning of the hearing, Emma dressed herself without being asked. She chose a navy blue dress with little white stars and asked if she could bring her bear. Michael told her of course she could. She sat beside him in the back of the car, legs swinging slightly, her hand resting quietly in his. Neither of them said much during the ride, but there was no fear in her face anymore. Only a fragile kind of peace. The courtroom was crowded but respectful. A few reporters sat in the back row, whispering to each other, scribbling in notepads. Michael ignored them. His focus was on Emma, seated beside her appointed child advocate, drawing quietly with a pink pen someone had given her. When the judge entered and called the room to order, the proceedings began. Michael's lawyer presented the DNA results, his living conditions, the steps he had taken to provide a safe, nurturing environment, and the therapy Emma had been receiving under his care. Dr. Riley even testified via video conference, sharing her professional assessment that Emma was bonded to Michael, that she had clearly begun to heal under his protection, and that removing her from his custody would almost certainly re-traumatize her. The judge listened carefully, occasionally watching Emma as she colored. Then he asked if the child wished to speak. The courtroom fell silent. Emma stood slowly. Her knees wobbled, and for a second, Michael's heart clenched. But she walked to the front of the room, teddy bear in hand, and turned to face the judge. "My name is Emma," she said clearly. "I didn't know my daddy before, but when I found him, I knew he was mine. I waited a long time, and when I needed him the most, he came for me. He didn't yell, he didn't hurt me. He stayed, and I want to stay with him. Because I love him." It was silent again, but this time, the silence was reverent. Michael looked down, blinking hard, his jaw clenched tight against the emotion rising in his chest. The judge nodded once, then addressed the room. "I see no reason to delay this any further. Custody is awarded to Michael Hayes effective immediately, case closed." Emma ran straight into Michael's arms. He caught her mid-jump, lifting her off the ground, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt something like wholeness, not pride, not relief, but peace. She buried her face in his neck and whispered, "We did it, Daddy." He closed his eyes and whispered back, "Yes, we did." Summer arrived slowly, softening the edges of the city's harsh skyline with warmth and golden light. The days grew longer, the breeze sweeter, and for the first time in many years, Michael Hayes woke up not to the buzz of an early conference call, or the pressure of an urgent deal, but to the sound of laughter echoing down the hallway of his home. Emma had developed a habit of racing through the apartment each morning, her bare feet slapping against the hardwood floors as she chased the family dog, a golden retriever she had named Leo, who had been adopted 2 weeks after the custody hearing. Michael wasn't entirely sure who had chosen whom. Leo had been shy at first, scarred from some unknown trauma, but Emma had simply sat beside him on the shelter floor and whispered, "It's okay, I'm scared too," and somehow, they had understood each other. The apartment no longer resembled the silent, sterile fortress it had once been. Emma's drawings now lined the walls in bright colors. Pictures of flowers, dogs, the two of them holding hands under skies filled with stars. Her toys lived scattered across the living room, her books filled entire shelves, and her giggles filled the spaces that used to be quiet. Michael still kept his office neat, but even that had softened. A framed photo of him and Emma stood beside his monitor, the two of them on the rooftop garden, she wearing oversized sunglasses and holding a melting ice cream cone, both of them mid-laugh. It was the first picture anyone had taken of him smiling like that. Work no longer ruled his life. After the custody was finalized, Michael had done what few believed he ever would. He stepped down from day-to-day operations of the company he had built from the ground up. The board had been stunned, investors even more so, but he'd stood before them and said clearly, without hesitation, "I built this company to escape the life I never wanted. Now I have a life I actually do." He remained as chairman, guiding major decisions, but the relentless pace had ended. Instead of red-eye flights and back-to-back meetings, his calendar now included things like parent-teacher conference, Emma's ballet recital, and Saturday make pancakes. He had also founded the Sarah Bennett Foundation, named in quiet honor of the woman he had failed, but whom he would never forget. The foundation focused on support for single parents with terminal illnesses, ensuring their children had care, resources, and, most of all, connection. He didn't publicize it for attention. The press picked it up anyway, praising the billionaire who had walked away from power to become a father. But he didn't do it for that either. He did it for Emma. For Sarah. For the man he had once promised himself he would never become, and who he was still trying every day not to be. Emma had started school again. Her teachers said she was quiet but brilliant. She asked thoughtful questions and listened closely, though she still flinched at loud noises and grew anxious when separated too long. Michael walked her to school most mornings, holding her hand the whole way. Sometimes she asked him about Sarah. He answered honestly but gently. He told her about her mother's kindness, about how fiercely she had loved her, and about how brave she had been. They visited her grave together once a month, leaving white lilies and drawings Emma had made. One evening, as the sun sank behind the skyline and turned the clouds a soft orange-pink, Emma stood barefoot on the balcony in her pajamas, watching the sky as the first stars began to appear. Michael stepped outside, drying his hands on a dish towel, and stood beside her. "Do you think Mom can see us?" she asked without turning her head. "I think she sees you," he said quietly, "every single day." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think she's proud of you?" Michael was silent for a long moment. He looked at the little girl beside him. The daughter he hadn't even known existed a few months ago. The child who had walked into his world, and shattered everything cold and broken inside it. He thought of Sarah's voice in her notebook, her faith in a man she had every reason to hate, and the way Emma had looked at him the first time she said, "Daddy." "I hope so," he said at last. "But I know I'm proud of you." She smiled then, leaning her head against his arm. "You're a good dad now." "I'm trying," he said, his voice tight with emotion. She looked up at him. "You don't have to try anymore, you already are." And just like that something settled inside him. Not just the guilt or the grief or the years of silence he had buried under boardrooms and concrete. But peace. Real, unshakable peace. They stood there in the warm breeze, a man who had spent most of his life building towers just to hide from love, and a little girl who had knocked every one of them down just by walking through the door. No more running, no more waiting. They were home. This story ends not with a grand gesture or dramatic twist, but with something far more powerful: healing. It's the quiet transformation of a man who built walls so high even he forgot what was on the other side, only to have them shattered by a child who needed nothing more than love, and gave it first. What makes the ending resonate is that it isn't perfect. Emma still carries trauma. Michael still carries guilt, but they choose each other, every day, in small honest ways. That's what makes this story beautiful. It's not about a billionaire saving a little girl. It's about a little girl saving a man from a life without meaning. It reminds us that redemption doesn't come from erasing the past. It comes from showing up again and again for someone who believes you can. And sometimes, that's all it takes to become a family.